These are some of the words that I was collecting as I prepared for today's presentation. We aren't asking you to submit this many. Please don't submit this many. We will not be able to cover all of these words or sort through them all. But there are a lot of themes that we wanted to explore today. And the words that really stood out to me were cultural participation. Many of the colleagues here in Balboa Park, as I'm sure many of you are aware of, was the LaPlaca-Cohen Culture Track report that explores cultural participation. How do we define a cultural experience? But more importantly, how do our visitors, our virtual users, and our potential audiences define a cultural experience? And what implications does that have on our role, the institutions play, and the services that we provide? What are the critical skills that will help us remain relevant in the 21st century as users redefine their cultural experiences? With all these questions and ideas, words at the top of our mind, we needed a speaker that could really touch upon the various threads we wanted to weave throughout the day. And having been largely supported by the Institute of Museum and Library Services for close to 7 years, Marsha Semmel's name is not unknown to us here at BPLI. Her career at the Institute of Museum and Library Services spanned 2003 to 2013, as she served as the agency's first director for strategic partnerships, the deputy director for the Office of Museum Services, and from March 2010 through January 2011 as the acting IMLS director. She is now an independent consultant working with foundations, museums, libraries, and various cultural organizations on learning, leadership, philanthropy trends, 21st century skills, strategic partnerships and collaborations, and cultural policy. So you can see why we've asked her to join us today. She currently serves as a senior advisor to the Noyce Leadership Institute, where she is a core member of the executive leadership team. She's also worked for the Women of the West Museum, the Conner Prairie, National Endowment for the Humanities, Smithsonian, and many more. So please check out her bio online and help me welcome, we're thrilled to have, Marsha Semmel.
Great to be here, and thank you so much, Amanda, for the introduction. And I wanted to start, before I get into the core of my remarks, by saying that Balboa Park is not an unfamiliar sight for me. When I first joined IMLS in 2003, one of the first IMLS board meetings, and the IMLS board is appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and Mick Hager hosted us in Balboa Park in, I think, 2003 or 2004, which was a great introduction, not only for some of us on staff, although I think I've been here before that, but for the board members who came from all over the country. And then I think it was in 2007 and 8 that, as part of our Connecting to Collections initiative under Director Ann Radice, we worked with our then board member Doug Myers, and we had one of 3 national symposiums on collections, this time focusing on living collections, at the San Diego Zoo and Balboa Park. So you have been a wonderful host for IMLS on a number of occasions. In addition, when I was getting to get started with the Connecting to Collections work, I met Peter Ellsworth and learned something about the Legler-Benbow Foundation. And through Peter, I got to know about the work of the Jacobs Center at Market Creek. And the work, I actually spent an afternoon there. Do you remember that, Peter? Where we sat with Rocky Barrows and some of the community residents and some of the leaders in Balboa Park and talked about the relationship between Balboa Park and the wonderful resources here and the Market Creek neighborhood and residents and their resources and their interests and enthusiasms. That interest in Market Creek has continued for me. It's become a core part of the Noyce Leadership Program. And every year we bring the Noyce Leadership Fellows to Balboa Park, to Market Creek, to learn something more about what's happening and to learn about developing strong, vital relationships with communities. So, having said that, the topic of my talk today is really going to be about collaborations and the future of collaborations in the world today, and why I think it's really essential from a business perspective and from a mission-related perspective to grow and nurture and keep at the hard work of collaborations. Because, as your councilman said, it's not easy work. It takes time. As Peter said to me this morning, sometimes it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but it's certainly worth it. And I also think that you are an amazing national example. You wouldn't be getting the kind of support that you've gotten from the Institute of Museum and Library Services for your partnership work if you didn't stand out in a national way. So part of what I'm going to do today is hopefully congratulate you and maybe even inspire you to the next level, to keep up that energy level, because I think it's something not just for you here in Balboa Park, but for the people online now and for other audiences to learn about and to learn from. So because I'm talking about partnership, I want to start by partnering with you. You're going to be listening to a lot of talking today. So I don't think we can do this with our online people, but how many of you in this room are involved in a partnership now? Okay, so take a minute or two, just think really quickly about one of the benefits of the partnership that you're in. What is something that you or your organization has learned? And I'll just ask you to shout it out loud. We don't have time to pass the microphone, but anybody have some benefits that you want to shout out? Shared resources. Anything else? Cross promotion. Great. Could you say that again? Audience? Broader audience. Great. Variety of perspectives. That's great. Okay. Keep those words in mind. Then I know these partnerships are going swimmingly, but is there anything you might want to talk about in terms of ways that your partnerships could be improved? What are your aspirations for your partnerships? Any thoughts? Could you say that? Specific accountability and clarity about people's roles. What else? Anything else that could be possibly improved? Consistent communication. I'm going to talk about that. Anything else? Transparency. Okay. All right. I think those are all really important and relevant. So this morning, I want to build on your experiences at Balboa Park. And obviously, you're already doing what I would call commons creating. You understand the power and potential of working together, that there are efficiencies to be gained by joining forces for marketing, for professional development. The Explorer Passes, I know, have been very successful, and other link services. And now with the Balboa Park Online Collaborative, you're making great progress in digitizing collections and creating portals, apps, and various other online resources. I applaud what you've done. But I want to now tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story about James. James is not from San Diego. He's from Scranton. And after I tell you a little about James, I'd like to talk about some current trends in collaborations and partnerships that may give you some inspiration for the next stage, what you're doing next, because you're always going to be thinking about the next thing, right? Just as the councilman said, there's always another mile to run and another way that you can improve what you're doing. So this is James. Am I causing this little thing here? How am I doing it? Oh, there you go. Sorry about that. So I've never met James, but I learned about him in October of 2013 when I was giving a talk at the University of Scranton in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And the lecture was organized by James's mother, who was a faculty member at the university. When I gave her my PowerPoint deck to load in advance of my talk, she ran over to me and she said, "That slide, that's my son." And you'll see that slide momentarily. But I was really curious about why that particular slide interested her so much. And we ended up having a long online correspondence. And not only did I correspond with her, but she interviewed James to get his views. And we were talking specifically about James's learning journey. It seems that James has some special needs, and he had some special issues, and his mother and his teachers had banded together to work with him. So here we are in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and the first thing that his mother told me about was that when James was 4, his parents had driven up to New York City and gone to the Museum of Modern Art, and they were waiting in line to go into the museum when a docent approached and asked James whether he wanted to participate in a special Tours for Fours program, which allowed 4-year-olds and their families to walk into the museum before the official opening hours. And so James and his mother and father and a group of about 15 people went into MoMA. There was a photographic exhibit up at that time about Mount St. Helens. And James remembered that he was given pencils, papers, crayons, and was able to sit on the floor and draw. And according to Denise, James's mother, James now thinks he owns that museum. And one of the last projects I did before I left IMLS was about the role of our institutions in the early learning environment. And that story makes my heart feel really good. Well, if we flash forward to this James, what was happening in the fall of 2013 was that with the close cooperation of teachers and the school administration, James, who had been doing terribly in his public school, was able to pursue a customized home education program that combined public school classes with online courses offered through a university-based gifted program and an online private school. He participated in physical activities at his state and regional parks and at the local YMCA. He took private music lessons, and he worked with his peers on teams for regional math and science competition. His parents and his teachers had united to make sure that there were strong pathways and connections to all kinds of museums and other offerings to customize James's learning journey. Now, what I'm going to read you now, and please bear with me, this is James's story. James sent me an email, and I'm editing it, but it's kind of long. So this is James at 12. Having the choice to learn in either the classroom or online is a good thing. Some subjects may be easier to learn in a classroom, for example, a foreign language, since students can speak together and practice their skills. At other times, students can learn better online or by themselves. In an online class, students can work as quickly or as slowly as they want until they learn the material. Sometimes it's better to work independently on something, like silent reading, just because the experience itself is more enjoyable. It's better to read at home at night with cocoa in the rain than in a classroom at school with cold desks and linoleum floors. You in San Diego probably don't know so much about cocoa in the rain and cold floors, but anyway, take it from me. Take it from James. He goes on, museums are good places to learn because it's sometimes easier to understand ideas by seeing how they are a part of real things. Many scientific ideas are easier to understand when students interact with objects and displays that demonstrate them. Flotation, for example, is something that is difficult to describe, but students can understand it easier if they see things actually floating at different levels in different liquids and moving up and down because of density and weight. This is our 12-year-old. The Da Vinci Science Center is a good place to see things like this, and so is the Franklin Institute. And I don't know if Steve Snyder came in, but Steve was in good measure responsible for a lot of wonderful experiences at the Franklin Institute before he came to Reuben Fleet. At other museums, like the Steamtown National Historic Site in the Lackawanna Coal Mine, students can interact with large artifacts like steam engines and move through unusual spaces like coal mines. It's very hard to get a good picture of these things because they are larger than humans, and humans need to be inside them to get really a sense of what they are like. A picture does not accurately represent the total darkness that can surround a person in a mine when all the lights are out. And he goes on. At art museums, it's interesting to see the paintings, sculptures, and also works of art that have to do with technology in the digital age. It's also fun to observe people who are visiting the museum. When students see something from a museum online, the experience of place is not the same. And then he goes on to talk about resolution, quality, color accuracy, and the fact that the pieces aren't necessarily displayed the way you see them in the museum. So that's James. Now, I don't know how many 12-year-olds you know, but James is clearly a pretty gifted young man, and a lucky one, because his teachers and his parents recognized that he had special needs and special interests and abilities, and they developed a seamless online, on-site learning menu for James. So what about the millions of other Jameses? What about the Jamals and the Jennifers and the Juanitas and the Jins? People of any age or any stage who don't have the supports and affordances that surrounded James. How can our cultural organizations join forces with each other and with other community learning resources to provide those pathways that Edutopia's Milton Chen calls effective and empowering education, with you in the middle? So let me begin with the obvious. As your work recognizes, and as Amanda alluded to, and we'll learn a lot more about this later today, we live in an increasingly networked and hyper-connected world, one that has dissolved and blurred boundaries between and across organizations, and radically shifted the expectations of all of our audiences about the role of cultural institutions in their lives. And you'll be hearing later today from Nick Honeysett and Mike Edson and Alex Friedman and Amy, I can't remember your last name, I'm sorry. Heibel, sorry, about the technological and digital trends and challenges that are facing all cultural institutions. And Joaquin, sorry Joaquin, I didn't memorize all of you. I happen to know Nick, Alex, and Mike better. And Amanda also alluded to the observations and conclusions of the 2014 La Placa-Cohen Culture Track study about trends in cultural consumption. Some of the ways that study describes today's audiences: overstimulated, overcommitted, promiscuous in their sense of loyalty or lack thereof, cynical, self-focused, and curious. The study also talks about such meta-trends as the search for authenticity. And boy, you here at Balboa Park have that in spades with the kinds of resources that you have. The importance of self-curation, and that role, the role of self-curation in our audiences today, and what the study calls collaborative consumption. In other words, wanting to have cultural experiences in a group. One of the conclusions of the La Placa-Cohen study is to create the cultural experiences of the future, meet audiences where they live, and understand how they feel. So, as much as you're doing here, and those of you who are listening from other places around the country or around the world, I would challenge you, in spite and because of all the wonderful things that you're doing, to think more and more intentionally about the ways that not only you're combining the resources here in the park to create better experiences for your visitors here, but what are some of the larger challenges of the city, the region, the state, the whole area that based on your mission, your resources, and your assets, you can address. And so now I'd like to talk about some of the trends that I think are characterizing our world, and some of the approaches that are being launched around the country. As I said, I still think you're a national model, but maybe I'll share a few others with you that you're not as familiar with. So this is a slide that is VUCA. And VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complicated, and ambiguous. And I first was introduced to the idea of the VUCA world by a futurist who's based in Palo Alto, and his name is Bob Johansen. So it's a world that's increasingly dominated by new discoveries, developments, and disruptions. Just think about it. Technology, the environment, demographics, the explosion of new knowledge, neuroscience, physiology, civil society, income distribution, the cloud. And Johansen, in his book, Leaders Make the Future, talks about these disruptions. Environments and affiliations that are based on people's interests. There are different activities, different events. And in the world that we're in today, we're increasingly seeing that these disruptions and these changes are forcing us to deal with wicked problems. What are wicked problems? Anybody know wicked problems? Okay. So wicked problems are, and this is actually something from one of the New Media Consortium brainstormings that I was part of, and you'll hear more about that later today. But we distinguish wicked problems from simple problems and even from complicated problems. A wicked problem does not have an easy to intuit or replicable solution. So simple problem, bake a cake. Complicated problem, launch a rocket. Once you've done it, you'll have a playbook. It might not always work, but there's a cookbook. Wicked problem, raising a child. So in his book, Leaders Make the Future, Bob Johansen talks about these wicked problems, and he talks about several skills necessary for leaders today. He talks about the maker instinct, dilemma flipping, constructive clarity, and rapid prototyping. And I think that what's kind of cool about that is in a lot of museums, we're already growing those skills in our audiences with our maker spaces and with prototyping exhibits and with thinking, giving people the space to consider alternatives to different challenges. One of the things that Bob talks about is that as a kind of counterweight to each of the more uncertain and scary parts of VUCA, there are aspects of leadership that can countermand that in a very positive way. So for volatility, vision. For uncertainty, cultivating understanding. For complications and complexity, noting clarity. And I think someone mentioned that earlier this morning already. And for ambiguity, mining our sense of agility. And I know that in the Balboa Park vision and mission statement, innovation and agility and connectedness are right there. So Bob talks about 10 different skills, but the 10th skill is something he calls commons creating. And he basically says this is not only the 10th skill, but it is the most important skill. And in fact, it's such an important skill to him that when he wrote his latest book in 2014, the early book was in 2009, he based his entire newest book, which he calls The Reciprocity Advantage, on this commons creating skill. Now, Bob works mostly with for-profits. So I've been in touch with him, and he gave me permission to slightly redefine this skill. The ability to stimulate, grow, and nurture shared assets that can benefit their players and create value at a higher level, not necessarily generate profits. So how do we deal, and what are some of the ways that people are dealing with these wicked problems? One of the things that has occurred in the last few years is that many people in the political world, the civic world, and the foundation world have really looked hard at their investments in individual institutions. And while they're able to see that their investments maybe will pay off in terms of a healthier individual institution, there's been a lot of hand-wringing in the larger philanthropic world about not really moving the needle in any kind of effective way on some of these wicked problems. So a very, very popular new approach is the collective impact approach. Have any of you heard of the collective impact approach? No. Okay. It's gotten its most airing in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. But this chart kind of shows what it's about. So from moving from organizations loosely collaborating while pursuing their own goals and metrics, all to the good of the organization, all probably benefiting individual people and audiences. The idea of entities aligning and pursuing aligned goals and metrics to multiply the impact and hopefully deal with some of our wicked problems. So this slide, it shows you something about the proposed benefits for collective impact. And you can read reams about this, and I don't nearly have enough time to go into it. But basically, I think even here in the park, you're showing a lot of the evidence of and the examples and traits of collective impact. Because the main traits of collective impact are creating a shared vision for change, creating a shared system for measuring the impact of what you do, developing a set of mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, maybe you need to communicate a little more, and providing backbone support. And what are the Balboa Park Cultural Partnership, the Learning Institute, or the Online Collaborative if they are not your backbone support? So collective impact has been spreading around the country, and then now it's spawning all sorts of various variations, but they're all focused on making a bigger difference in the system. And there are efforts now, there are hundreds of efforts going on right now to address such problems as academic achievement, college and career readiness, substance abuse, youth incarceration, domestic violence, and literacy. So some of the strengths of collective impact are on a slide in front of you. Aligning unique resources of different already existing organizations. One of the premises of collective impact is that the solutions to the problems you seek and you're encountering are already in your community. It's not about creating a brand new solution. It's about digging deeper into the community you are in, looking at and creating a process that is transparent, that is continuous, that is structured, and that builds strong relationships among the various organizations in order to really come out the other side and make a change. So one of the key elements is this notion of everybody is collecting data now, right? You're all collecting data, but what are those data? What is that information that can be particularly useful for a particular issue or a particular problem? And I think we have some issues now where we are collecting all this information. How often do we go back to it? How often do we parse it so that we really understand this is a number that we really have to look at. This is a measure. And maybe we can let some of these other measures go because if we really want to attack this problem, we have to look at this number. One of the ways a collective impact promoter talks about it is he says, use data as a flashlight, not a hammer. Another aspect of collective impact is recognizing that there is no one silver bullet that will solve these problems. So they talk about using silver buckshot, not silver bullets. And finally, perhaps the most important thing is to create a transparent process of relationship building among all the partners, one that privileges contribution rather than attribution. And this school administrator from Texas had a quote that I love. He says, progress moves at the speed of trust. And I can tell you from the time I've spent down at the Jacob Center in Market Creek, that maxim, I think, is really true. And I don't know whether that's been true for the way you've been proceeding here at Balboa Park. Progress moves at the speed of trust. Well, let me go back here. I'm going ahead of myself. Just as everybody's touting the value of collective impact, there's all sorts of criticisms of it now, right? And one of the criticisms is that it's too top-down. It's too funder-driven. And I don't have a slide for this, but I want to say that it is extremely important to think about that, because even as we cultural organizations develop our projects and our programs, we disconnect from the communities we serve at our own peril, in my view. One of the people who's been now working on putting community back in collective impact is a gentleman named Rich Harwood. And Rich has the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation. He's based in Washington, but he's working now with some IMLS and Gates Foundation support with the American Public Library Association and public libraries all over the country. He's worked with United Way worldwide, and in fact, I think he's working on a project here in San Diego. And he was actually called into Newtown, Connecticut to work with the families and communities there after the horrible killings at the elementary school in Newtown. So one of the things that Rich talks about is that you cannot impose strategy on anybody who doesn't want to have it imposed on them. And his language is one about creating conversations around shared aspirations, around connecting and learning something about people's beliefs, what they're bringing to their community, understanding that every community has a story, a public narrative that they own, and that public narrative at any length of any moment in time, depending on what's happening in the community, might be one of possibility, or it might be one of no possibility and no promise. And once you start working with your communities, you need to know about that. You need to be listening. So as you think about the role and the work that's being done here at the partnership, which is so important, and I know you reach out to communities, that listening piece, that creating really authentic conversation piece is a very, very vital part of the work. And it's certainly one that I came to very late in my career. I became a director in Indiana in 1996, and I just thought it was about presentation. And then I read John Falk and Lynn Deerking's book about the museum experience, and I realized that all these people coming to Conner Prairie were not empty vessels. They actually had things on their mind, and they might have things on their mind that are about, like, will I find a restroom? Or will I get a drink of water? Or they might have a specific issue about agriculture or something like that in their past. So that's when we started to change things at Conner Prairie. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the organizations that have boldly moved into some new arenas and are dealing with some of those consequences right now. Have any of you ever heard of KaBOOM? Okay, well, KaBOOM is a national and international program. It's run by a man named Daryl Hammond, and it is about developing playgrounds, community-based playgrounds in communities all over the world. And this has been a very successful business. What they've actually created a kind of playbook for how you create a playground that's very much about being with the community and responding to the community. But Daryl hasn't been satisfied in spreading these playgrounds because for him, there's a different kind of urgency around the health of the children in our country. And so what he's doing now is he's about changing norms and behaviors around the benefits of what he calls playability on the health and well-being of all members of the community. So he still has some staff doing the playgrounds, but now he's partnering with city officials, demographers, and organizations to make the city, the entire city, the platform for action. That means he's using digital maps and mapping all potential playability enablers in a city and mapping out all the potential playability barriers, looking at bike lanes, traffic lights, park benches, bus routes, and developing collectively strategies to broaden access and awareness of play. And this is for people of all ages. Well, in a recent call with our Noyce Leadership Institute alumni, Daryl candidly described some of the impacts of this change. It's been really hard, and harder in some ways than he expected, because he's working with different funders. He's creating different measures of success. Some of his old partners don't want to work with him anymore. His staff has been going through a lot of changes because now they need a new set of skills. And those skills that Daryl mentioned in our phone call actually mirror some of the skills that Bob Johansen talked about and that you talk about at Balboa Park. The most important skills for him now: strategic agility, the ability to thrive within ambiguity, the willingness to let go of a cherished project if somebody else pipes up and says they can do it better. And for Daryl as the leader, an approach to risk-taking that provides space for making mistakes, but tries to ensure that the team doesn't make the same mistakes too many times in a row. So, with those in mind, let's go back to James. This is the slide that piqued James's mother's interest. This is a picture from a report issued by a group called KnowledgeWorks, which is a nonprofit based in Cincinnati, Ohio. And it was their Future of Learning Forecast 3.0, which they called the recombinant education, regenerating the learning ecosystem. And you can see that the point of this diagram is that rather than have a child or a learner, I would say, of any age, try to adapt to one particular type of institution, one particular type of learning modality, we have all of these different modalities: our cultural organizations, our museums, our devices, our homes, our schools, and all of them have the potential, given technology, to be linked in a much more seamless way in an effective learning ecosystem. But that only happens if we have the willpower to do that. And the report that KnowledgeWorks issues presents this rosy picture, which I would argue that that is a great picture of James's learning journey. But it also warns that if we don't start thinking about collaboration in some new and innovative ways, that we stand the risk of greater fragmentation, greater inequity, and leaving many, many more learners behind. So I'm kind of rounding third now, heading for home. I'm going to go here. So I'm going to talk about a couple of examples. These are all works in progress examples that are happening elsewhere in the United States that might be inspiring for you, and you might want to think about looking at as you move forward with the collaborations that you're involved with. This one is the Chicago City of Learning. And have any of you heard of the City of Learning movement? Mike has, and someone else over here. So this is a national movement that is gaining traction. It began in Chicago, kind of began, I think, around the same time in Pittsburgh, and now it's moving to Dallas, Washington, D.C., and in a limited way to Los Angeles. So this is a movement that seeks to harness the assets of a community and transform it into a network of seamless pathways of in-school, out-of-school, and online experiences that enable young people to explore their interests, develop new skills, and connect their learning to real-world opportunities. The Chicago City of Learning project grew out of the city's 2013 Summer of Learning program, in which more than 100 youth-serving organizations joined together to make their programs more visible. A big part of the program is a digital badging program, and this was inaugurated in the summer of 2013. There were many, many, many glitches, and really all that was recorded in terms of the badges that summer was I participated in the program. Now that system is becoming much more sophisticated, and through the badges, the students can and youth can ladder up in terms of their skill sets and skill developments. They can map their own learning pathways, and they can receive various incentives and awards. Now, I had the opportunity recently to sit down with the administrator of the Chicago City of Learning program, and she showed me on her computer what is being done now to identify, using a variety of overlaid maps that look at bus routes, they look at demographics, they look at neighborhood characteristics, they look at income levels, they look at ethnic and cultural concentrations, and what they're doing now, and they look at program activity offerings and demands for programs, and they are isolating, identifying where the learning deserts are in the greater Chicago area so that they can work with a group of civic officials and funders to remedy those learning deserts. And I think as much as anything, and this is very much behind what Daryl Hammond is doing with playability, Washington, D.C. has a great bike share system. But when he did his map, he found that a whole quadrant of the city was not being served at all by the bike share program. So we have the capability now of addressing these learning deserts in a productive way. In Pittsburgh, their initiative is called Remake Learning, and this has been created over a number of years by 7 different foundations and the city and several universities and corporations and the libraries, all the museums, creative art firms, media firms, and the schools. And what this project is about is it focused specifically on several skill areas, which include maker practices, digital technologies and learning, creative arts, early childhood education, media production, and STEAM learning. And again, the goal is to enhance the learning capacity of the entire greater Pittsburgh region. It has a backbone, the Sprout Fund, which benefits from local and national funding as well as city support. And it's also embraced digital badging. And I had sent my slides ahead of time before I read last Friday's post on the Remake Learning website, where they have just gone through a multi-month process where they've developed a comprehensive set of specific, observable learning competencies and outcomes in conjunction with their experiences and their badges. So they've got ways now through these badges to assess skills, knowledge, and dispositions across a variety of domains, including career readiness, coding and gaming, design and making, early childhood education, media making, robotics, and STEAM. I'm gonna move ahead here because I want to leave some time for some questions. And I'm moving now to a single institution. So this is not a collaborative institution in itself. It's a collaborative institution, but it's not a collaboration. And this is the work of Nina Simon up at the Museum of Art and History in Santa Cruz. Nina, who believes deeply in transparency, just posted a wonderful prezi on YouTube about her theory of change that she supports at the Museum of History and Art in Santa Cruz. Because for her, the ultimate goal of the museum is to grow that the community grows stronger and more connected. So everything that they are doing at the Museum of Art and History, and again, because of her Museum 2.0 blog and the fact that every single thing is posted on the website, everything is about meaningful opportunities for visitor engagement. And what's interesting to me is that Nina has been a student of Robert Putnam. He wrote a book called Bowling Alone, which is about the nature of social capital and the lack thereof, or places where our institutions are creating ways for people who know each other to bond even deeper. So Nina is very intentional about supporting social capital, but she's also very intentional about what she calls bridging capital. And that is the capital that brings strangers together for experiences that help them get to know each other in meaningful ways that foster their own individual creativity as well as a stronger community. And I urge you, to follow some of the experiments and some of the work that Nina's doing. In her book, The Participatory Museum, Nina talks specifically about the power of certain social objects. And now she's talking more and more about the power of people and the engagement, not just with objects and exhibits, but with people in our institutions. So finally, I'm showing a book cover of a book I have not even seen. So you'll forgive me if this doesn't if this doesn't meet the expectations that have been made for it. But this is a book about, again, museums in the life of the city by Gail Lord and Gary Blankenberg. It's called Cities, Museums, and Soft Power. And this book is a whole set of case studies of different cities around the world and where and how museums have worked with cultural officials and the publics to change a sense of engagement and community activism. So, as I bring this to a close, I wanted to just say a few more words about the traits and capacities that I think are really important for us to grow as we move into this connected world, because we're in the world already. And the question for us, and I believe deeply that the question for our sustainability and our relevance will be how effectively we join in that world and how effectively we embrace it. So there was just a recent article about the dawn of something called system leadership that surfaced 3 core capabilities for this world that we're in. The ability to see the larger system, the big picture, the ability to foster reflection and more generative conversations. And I know from all of my years in museums and in the government agencies that it is damn hard to stop and reflect. It is really, really hard, but it's really important that we do it. And then the last skill is moving the collective focus from reactive problem solving, and goodness knows we have enough challenges, to co-creating the future. David Carr, who is a wonderful librarian who's worked a lot with museums, and he's been a mentor to me. He recently gave a talk at the Smithsonian Institution to the staff across the institution. I wasn't able to go because I think it was bad weather and I just didn't feel like leaving my home. But guess what? I just saw it live streamed. And what he exhorted his audience to think about was to cultivate openness. And by that, he was not referring to open technology platforms. He was referring to the creation of open environments, what he called environments of possibility, characterized by conviviality, generosity, and what he called service to the unfinished, open lives of all people. This again gets back to this idea that nobody comes to our institutions without things on their mind and without their own gifts and their own things that they can offer to us. So he urged everybody to listen more, and to make themselves vulnerable in their institutions, to have conversations in the institutions. He deeply believes that all of our cultural institutions and our cultural organizations are pillars of our democratic society. And in his final comments, he urged people to create an open field for citizens to do the building and providing the lumber that democratic conversations require. Think about that. Think about our institutions having that lumber in our resources, in our people, in our places, to start building increased democratic conversations. So, as the LaPlaca-Cohen study mentioned, meet audiences where they live and understand how they feel. And as Bob Johansen said, connectivity is our strength. So let me end with a question for you again. Are you doing all that you can do with the vast and wondrous resources of Balboa Park, or your city, or your museums, and your performing arts organizations, and your theaters, and your gardens, and your zoos? Are you doing all that you can do to make a difference in people's lives? To respond to the curiosity that they have about the world, to add to their meaning-making and their sense-making, and to help them strengthen the bonds with those they know and create new connections to unfamiliar ideas, people, and places. Thank you very much. So I think we have some time, although we have some time. We have about 10 minutes. I know that was a whole lot to throw at you, and I apologize for dumping it all on you, but I hope that it adds to the conversations that you already have. And I would love to hear your thoughts or comments or reactions. Does this ring true? Did I ignore some key challenges or concerns and gloss over them? Yes, please.
When you talked about, I get a microphone, yay.
Yes, you get a microphone. Thank you.
Look out. And they even let me hold it. When you talked about shared vision from many sources,
right.
I thought immediately of our centennial.
Yes.
And how that project has been a focal point for us in the park to create a new reality, to collaborate, and to do all those things. And I wonder, after the centennial is over, what is our next vision going to be? You don't have the answer to that, obviously, but I'm certainly wondering about it, and I'm thinking about how our centennial represents the manifestation of so many elements that you talked about.
Well, I think that's great, and I wonder whether the process and connections that were made in leading up to the centennial, whether you'll have that kind of the remainder of that. You'll have that, and you can cherish it. I know I've had some conversations with people involved in the NISENet network, which was a huge nanotechnology initiative funded for about 10 years by the National Science Foundation, which has created something like 250 partners. And right now, NISENet is trying to think about, we don't want, even though NSF isn't going to fund us the same way, we don't want to lose our connections. So I know there's a lot of thinking about that, because the trust building, the relationships, and the look at the entire community of San Diego is something that you can keep working on as you envision the future. I think that's a wonderful statement. Yes. Oops.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. This kind of profound collaboration involves risk-taking, and so often in the world of nonprofits, organizations are just dealing with survival.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about balancing those challenges?
Well, and it's been fascinating to me to move a little more into the corporate, or learn more about the corporate world too, about this, because I think what Nina Simon talks about, what Bob Johansen talks about, and probably what some of you do, is the idea of creating prototypes. How do you create experiments that have a specific goal, have a beginning and an end, empower people, and then you learn from them. You have to stop and learn from them. And I think it's really, really important for any organization to think about devoting some time and resources to that work. And the wonderful thing about that is, and I used to do a little of this when I was a museum director, is if you present something as an experiment and you engage people in it, people get really excited. They like the idea that this isn't something that's meant to last for 35 years. And frankly, in our world today, very few things will be able to last for 35 years. So one of the things that Nina Simon talks about is she has needed supplies for her museum. I mean, when she took over that museum, it was in terrible shape. And her first act as the director was to give herself a 25% pay cut. That was the first thing she did. And, as can happen occasionally in one of the cultural institutions, her second week on the job, she discovered they had like 1 week's left payroll or something. So, but they wanted, they were doing some project and they needed boxes. Well, she just put out a call for boxes, and people came with these boxes. And they wanted to do something that was meaningful. They didn't want to just sign a guest book and, provide some response to an experience. And it's a different kind of mindset, But I think when I was at the Hallmark World Headquarters in Kansas City last October, we saw 8 different incubator businesses at Hallmark, none of which have the Hallmark name. And Hallmark has a particular strategy. They're all much younger than my son, all these young people who are doing this, but they set them off. They have to come up with a proposal. They set them off. They give them minimal resources. Every few months, they have to demonstrate the results that they're getting. And that's the way Hallmark is seeding its future, because the world of sending birthday cards or bar mitzvah cards the way I might have is changing very dramatically. I don't know if that helps, but I think that that's something that we don't think about experimentation quite as often as I think we might. Yes?
Thank you. So often, organizations compete for funding from the same funders.
Right.
And when you talk about collaboration, can you give us some examples of funders today who are taking the next step to looking at collaboratives and how they can support them?
Well, the entire collective impact sort of formal work, which is which a number of funders have bought into, is all about that, where the funder is basically changing the funding criteria, changing the guidelines, and basically saying, we are not going to fund things that unless they're collaborations. Now, this is very disruptive, right? Because what this means is that some organizations don't get the same funds that they expected, and they have to hit a different bar. And one of the big debates now in the philanthropic community is, let's get our own act together so we don't have 10 different kinds of reporting requirements and 10 different deadlines for our various collective impact efforts. And I think there's still a lot of bugs to be worked out there, but I think you're going to see this trend move forward. I don't think it's going to go back. And there is a resource called Grant Makers for Effective Organizations, which is a coalition of something like 500 or 600 foundations, I think. And they've been doing a lot of work with funders around working in different relationships with their grantees and potential grantees, supporting them, supporting their evaluation efforts. So there's some real churn in the philanthropic world as well. But it can be a pinch when these changes happen. And I don't know how many people here are board members from cultural organizations, but this is a place where it requires some reframing of the board mindset as well. Because it's not just about the health. Yes, it's about the health of a single institution, but that may or may not cut it with the kind of new donors that are coming on the scene now. And of course, the lines between for-profits and nonprofits are blurring hugely, so that you've got B corporations, you've got triple bottom line corporations, you've got social investors. So it's not just the world of the nonprofit that is the slam dunk if you want to do something for social good. There are many, many other choices for people to invest in. And if those of you don't know her, I highly, highly recommend that you read the work of Lucy Bernholz, Bernholz. And she she publishes, I think it's called Philanthropy and Civil Society. But she talks about the changes in philanthropy and the implications for organizations like ours in the world of the shared economy, in the world of the digital social economy, and what that means. And as she points out, there's no business model now to make a successful nonprofit digital infrastructure. And so we're all learning this at the same time. And the other thing she points out is that, and she's very dubious about Kickstarter being the saving grace of all of our nonprofits. And she also points out that once you start talking about digital infrastructure and fundraising and supporting what is absolutely a vital part of any organization now, it requires participation by everybody throughout the whole organization. So oftentimes that's relegated to, you know, our IT person or our digital media person, but she talks about the fact that it involves everybody. And pointed to, on the day we had one of our conversations with her, one of our participants works in a natural history museum where someone had jumped on one of the dinosaurs and taken selfies and tweeted them all over the world, and the poor security guard was beside himself. So, and this was ricocheting throughout the whole public affairs community in terms of the museum. So there are a lot of implications of the world that we're in now that we haven't really figured out yet. Other questions? One more, and then I think that's the last one. Amanda's giving me the high five here.
So I'm just wondering, kind of bouncing back to a previous question about sort of just risk in institutions and taking risks with different projects or programs or new means of funding, and tying it into the broader question about collaboration. It's tricky enough sometimes encouraging one institution to go on a risky venture that might yield fantastic results, especially in a digital age, but might also be somewhat catastrophic for a nonprofit. So what advice might you have, I'm wondering, on doing that on a larger scale with partners? What advice do we have for collaborating on a risky venture with multiple institutions, potentially?
Well, as that fellow in Texas says, progress moves at the speed of trust. So I think you have to really think about, A, whether collaboration is the way to address the issue you're at hand. Collaboration is not the way to go for every single problem or challenge that you have, right? And collective impact is not a panacea for everything either. So what's happening now is that some people are creating these overly complicated processes and mechanisms that they really don't need to create to solve some of the more simple or just complicated problems that they have to solve. I think I've written a lot about partnerships, and I think one of the things is you have to dedicate the proper resource to really wrangle the partnership. And that is essential, and too often that doesn't happen, so people get torn in many different directions. And so the partnership tending, like growing your garden, isn't really happening, and the field is going to go fallow. And you have to really set at the outset, what are your goals? Why are we doing this? And you have to be willing to listen and set out attainable goals. And they might be much smaller than the goals you ultimately want to achieve. But celebrate the successes of getting something small done together. I will never forget the afternoon I spent years ago now at Market Creek, where I learned about how the residents brought, this is a highly diverse neighborhood, of course, where they were arguing about colors that were going to characterize this new development. And they each brought cloth from their respective ethnic or cultural group. And what they saw when they brought the cloth was they saw commonality. And this goes back again to this notion of conversation around aspiration and hope and vision, and then working backwards to say, well, what's one thing we can do now? So that might be easy for me to say and hard for you to do in whatever institution you're in, but time and time again, I've seen that happen. You have to give time for partnership and collaboration to grow, and that's why you choose those partnerships and collaborations carefully. And you know what? It's just like dating. You might go on a date with someone and decide, you know what? I do not want to go steady with you. So there's nothing wrong with saying, I had a great time, that's great, but you know, we're getting a divorce here. So that can happen too. You have to know when to fold. Thank you so much, everybody.